He grew up in the suburbs. He had never hunted, never built anything, never farmed a single acre of land. Today, he lives in a federally designated wilderness zone so remote that the state of Alaska has largely stopped trying to reach it. That man is Dennis Westerlind, the man behind Holdfast Alaska, and the story of how he got from a small apartment in eastern Massachusetts to a log cabin on the edge of Wrangell, St. Elias National Park is not what it looks like from the outside. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly what drove Dennis to keep pushing deeper into the wilderness, and why so many people who have never set foot in Alaska feel like they know exactly what he's talking about. Start with where Dennis actually came from, because most people who watch Holdfast Alaska assume they're watching someone who was born for this. He wasn't. Dennis Westerlind grew up in a densely populated town in New England. No farm, no land, no family tradition of hunting or foraging or building your own shelter. When he entered the workforce, he took a job working as a lobsterman for his father-in-law's fishing company on the coast of eastern Massachusetts. His wife Amy worked for the same company as its secretary. They lived in a small apartment. They were, by every external measure, a perfectly ordinary suburban couple in their early years of marriage. But something was already pulling at Dennis, something that didn't fit the apartment, the steady paycheck, the predictable rhythm of shore work. He and Amy started making weekend trips to Maine. They explored the woods, they read, they talked. On the small patio of their apartment, Amy started growing tomatoes and other vegetables in containers, a tiny act of self-sufficiency that, in hindsight, was the first brick in a much larger structure. Most people who have that restless itch never act on it. They talk about it at dinner. They watch other people do it on TV. They like posts on social media about homesteading and tell themselves that someday, when the timing is right, they might try something like that. Dennis and Amy were not most people. They started saving, not loosely, not vaguely, but with a specific target in mind. Overgrown acres in western Maine. Land that nobody had touched in years. Land that would take serious work to make livable. Land that, to most people looking at it, looked like a problem. To Dennis, it looked like a beginning. And if you think that was the bold move in this story, stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. They bought those overgrown acres in western Maine, and they cleared them. No background in construction, no background in farming. No one to call who had done this before. Just two people who had decided, against the advice of nearly everyone around them, that they were going to build an off-grid homestead from the ground up. Dennis has been blunt about this. If we had listened to everybody who told us right from the start not to move to Maine, don't buy land, don't move to Alaska, we wouldn't have done anything. He and Amy grew up in the suburbs. Neither of them came from farming families. Nobody handed them a manual. What they did instead was absorb everything they could from the people around them, locals, books, trial and error, and apply it directly to the land they now owned. They cleared it. They built a simple structure on it. No internet, no electricity, no running water. None of it deterred them. It was precisely what they had asked for. Amy became a herbalist during these years, learning to use what the land produced as both a practical skill and a source of income. Dennis farmed and took odd jobs. Together, they turned that overgrown property into a functioning off-grid homestead. And then, when they had learned what that land had to teach them, they sold the cabin they had built with their own hands. They moved to a nearby farmhouse for a short transitional period, filling in gaps, preparing for something bigger. Because western Maine, as remote as it felt to the people they had left behind in Massachusetts, was not remote enough for Dennis. Here's what the comments kept asking, and here's the answer they never got, until now. The move to Alaska was not impulsive. Dennis and Amy had been thinking about it for years, talking about it since the early days of their marriage, back in that small apartment in eastern Massachusetts. Alaska was not a fantasy. It was a destination. And when the time came, they moved toward it the same way they had moved toward everything else, deliberately, with a plan, and with a young daughter named Lena in the back seat. In November 2020, the Westerlind family drove 3,200 miles from their homestead in western Maine to the port of Bellingham, Washington. They loaded their car onto a ferry. They pushed off into the northern Pacific. The seas were 36 feet high. Dennis had worked as a lobsterman. He knew what rough water felt like. This was different. For 5 days, the ferry crossed those conditions in the dark. Lena was with them the entire time. They arrived in Alaska, having never set foot in the state before. That detail matters. They didn't research it on foot first. They didn't take a scouting trip. They drove to the ferry, loaded the car, and went. Their first property was a 2-acre homestead on the outskirts of the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. coastal Alaska, salmon on the Kenai River, moose and elk in the surrounding area. By most people's standards, genuinely remote and genuinely wild. For Dennis, it felt like Maine with better scenery. It was a bit too crowded, he said, too much like Maine. We were looking for a more authentic, wild Alaskan experience. 6 years in Alaska, and he was already planning the next move. Most people who know this story stop here, but the real story starts right now. In the spring of 2024, Dennis and Amy packed up again. This time, they weren't moving to a different state. They were moving deeper into the same one, into a part of Alaska that most Alaskans never see. They paid cash for a small off-grid log cabin on 7 acres near the northern entrance of Wrangell St. Elias National Park. Their new address, Slaana, Alaska. Population approximately 100 people. Wrangell St. Elias is the largest national park in the United States, covering more than 13 million acres, larger than the entire country of Switzerland. Dennis and Amy bought land at its northern edge, in a place where state services are thin, roads are minimal, and the nearest significant supply run takes the better part of a day. And here is the detail most people covering Holdfast Alaska miss entirely. Because of their remote location and the lack of state resources in the area, the Westerlinds live inside a federally designated subsistence zone, a legal classification, not a lifestyle label. In a subsistence zone, residents are permitted to harvest significantly larger quantities of food from the land because the government recognizes that the land is the primary means of feeding themselves. What that means in practice. When they lived on the Kenai, Dennis could legally harvest 45 sockeye salmon per year for his family. In the subsistence zone near Slaana, that number is 500. 500 salmon per year, not as a record haul, but as a legal baseline allowance. Hunting windows are longer, bag limits are higher, the sun disappears for most of the day in deep winter, rising around 10:30 in the morning and gone again by 3 in the afternoon. They encounter wolves near the water source. They are, by law as much as by choice, living in a way that most Americans have no framework to understand. And that's when the decision was made, the one nobody around them saw coming. They didn't start the YouTube channel when they moved to Maine. They didn't start it when they first arrived in Alaska. They didn't start it when the subsistence lifestyle started to take shape. They started it in September 2024, after the second Alaska move, after 14 years of homesteading, after all of it had already been built. We bought a GoPro and just started taking videos of ourselves messing around on the homestead, Dennis said. And people took to it. That sentence deserves a second look. A GoPro, messing around. This was not a calculated content play with a production team and a brand strategy. It was 2 people who had been living this life for over a decade, who finally started pointing a camera at it. The channel is called Holdfast Alaska, and unlike most homesteading channels on YouTube, which focus on gardens and livestock, seasonal harvests, and vegetable preservation, Dennis and Amy built something different. They documented what a full subsistence life actually looks like, not the clean, aesthetic version. Supply runs to Anchorage that takes 17 hours round trip, building an A-frame chicken coop with a living roof, a layer of soil and vegetation designed to hold heat through winters that would kill most structures not built for them. Hunting moose and porcupine for dinner. Preserving Copper River salmon using a method that requires no electricity, just sun, smoke, and wind, the way it was done long before refrigeration existed. Amy shaped a clear educational mission alongside all of it. She wanted the channel to be a place where people could learn to can, forage, and use herbal medicine, whether they lived off the grid or not. Within months of launching, the channel had accumulated more than 32 million cumulative views. And if you think that was surprising, stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. There is a version of the off-grid content world that is aspirational to the point of being dishonest. Cabins styled by a magazine, fires glowing at exactly the right color temperature, difficulties mentioned but never truly felt through the screen. Holdfast Alaska is not that. When Dennis talks about the winter darkness, the sun not appearing until nearly 10:30 in the morning, gone again by 3 in the afternoon, he doesn't frame it as atmosphere. He describes it as one of the hardest adjustments of his life. When Amy talks about the constant learning curve of remote living, she is not performing humility. She grew up in suburban New England. She did not arrive in Alaska knowing how to preserve fish or navigate a subsistence harvest season. The audience response to that honesty has been significant. Viewers who have never set foot in Alaska, who live in cities, suburbs, apartment buildings, watch Holdfast Alaska and recognize something in it. Not the specific skills, not the geography, but the underlying impulse, the desire to live in a way that is directly connected to the work you put in. Amy put it plainly, "We're very hardworking. We have a lot of grit." And with the homestead, Dennis and I feel very rewarded that the hard work we put in directly relates to how we live day to day. That sentence is the engine of the channel. It is also, for most people watching it at home, something that their current life does not give them: the connection between effort and outcome, unmediated by an employer, or a paycheck, or a system built to absorb what you produce and return a fraction of it. Dennis built that, not by being exceptional from birth, by refusing to stay somewhere that didn't match what he was trying to build, over and over again, until he ended up somewhere that did. But here's the part that changes everything about what you just heard. Living at the northern edge of Wrangell, St. Elias is not a romantic decision. It is a logistical one, and it comes with costs that most people watching the channel from their phones will never fully reckon with. The supply runs alone tell the story. The nearest city with full shopping infrastructure is Anchorage, and the drive there and back from Slana takes roughly 17 hours. You don't go for a few things, you go for everything. You plan months ahead, calculate what you might need for the season, and build in margin for error, because if you forget something and conditions close the road, you are simply without it. There is no grid power, no municipal water, no services on demand. The water supply comes from the land itself. That's also where the wolves come in. Encounters near the water source are not unusual for the Westerlinds, and this is not a detail Dennis dramatizes. It's a working condition of where they live. The channel also sits inside a members-only structure, meaning a portion of their content and their primary direct audience exists behind a subscription layer on YouTube. This is how the operation sustains itself financially, alongside the ad revenue from the broader public-facing content. They are not purely off-grid idealists rejecting the attention economy. They are working within it, deliberately, using it to fund the life they built before any camera was rolling. And that distinction matters for understanding Dennis. He did not build the homestead to get the channel. He built the channel because the homestead already existed. The life was real first. The camera was the last addition, not the foundation. What happened next is the reason this story spread across the internet. One of the clearest windows into what day-to-day life looks like for Dennis is the fish wheel. A fish wheel is one of the oldest salmon harvesting tools used in Alaska. It operates on the current of the river itself, the water turning the wheel, scooping salmon out and depositing them into a holding box. No motor, no electricity, just engineering and flow. The technology spread across Alaska during the gold rush era, adopted from indigenous harvesting methods, and it remains one of the primary ways that subsistence residents along rivers like the Copper harvest their annual quota. Dennis uses a fish wheel on the Copper River. The federal subsistence fishing zone that covers his area near Slana specifically identifies fish wheel registration as part of the annual permitting process at the Slana Ranger Station, the station that services the community where the Westerlinds live. In a recent video documented by a neighboring channel, Dennis's fish wheel broke loose from its mooring and began drifting downriver in the Copper River current. A neighbor went down the river to salvage it before it was lost entirely. The fish wheel wasn't just property, it was food. That wheel, during salmon season, is one of the primary mechanisms that fills a significant portion of that 500 salmon subsistence quota. Losing it wasn't an inconvenience. It was a direct threat to a season's worth of protein. This is the texture of Dennis's life that a highlight reel cannot capture. The real story is not the beautiful shots of the wilderness or the satisfying moments of a completed build. The real story is what happens when something breaks in a place where nothing is easily replaced and help is not close. You make do, you adapt, you call your neighbor, you go down the river. That is Holdfast Alaska. Dennis Westerlind is not a man who found his calling. He's a man who built it, piece by piece, over more than a decade, in places most people would never choose, in conditions most people would not survive comfortably. He started with an apartment in Massachusetts, a lobster boat, and a dream that had no roadmap. He ended up on 7 acres at the edge of the largest national park in the United States, harvesting 500 salmon a year and teaching hundreds of thousands of strangers how to live more deliberately. Right now, the channel is still growing. The homestead near Slana is actively in operation. Dennis and Amy are raising Lena in a subsistence zone that most Americans couldn't find on a map, preserving salmon using methods that predate modern refrigeration, and building the kind of life that cannot be faked on camera because it would fall apart without the skill to back it up. Dennis started with nothing, no skills, no land, no knowledge, no blueprint. He just refused to stop. So here's the question for you. Dennis walked away from 2 lives most people would have been content to keep. Which version of him took the biggest risk, The man who left Massachusetts, the man who left Maine, or the man who left coastal Alaska for something even more remote? Let me know below.